Aloha to all of you who are participating in this webinar. As all of you know, when there's a change of presidential administration, it's a time for anyone who has any thoughts about policy changes to flood the media with advice to the incoming administration. And a lot of Chinese government connected commentators are also participating in this flood of advice. Some directly and publicly using the American media because, of course, we have relatively open access media and a high degree of freedom of political discussion. Nothing comparable in terms of Americans giving advice to Xi Jinping, for example. This year is especially important to the Chinese because of the recent downturn in relations between the United States and China. As a bit of background from the Chinese viewpoint, most Chinese, I think, agree with the general proposition that U.S. policy toward China is containment, or some with maybe different versions of what people think that actually means, some form of containment. In essence, it means Chinese think that generally the United States government is opposed to China becoming strong because that would impinge on America holding that position in the Asia Pacific. So the Chinese public and the Chinese government tends to interpret the issues that come between the United States and China through that lens. The Taiwan issue, for example, Chinese think that Americans are using international law, which they think is largely written by Westerners in recent times, rather than taking into account Chinese views, is used as a weapon against China. They think that the United States campaign to spread democracy and to promote the protection of human rights globally is principally aimed at overthrowing the Communist Party of China as a ruling party. Chinese see the Huawei episode as an attempt by Americans to drag down a Chinese company that happens to have done well in the international marketplace. They see economic decoupling as another weapon to try to keep China from getting too strong. Chinese also tend to think, and I think more and more in recent years, that the more China rises, that is, becomes relatively powerful, the greater the United States will make an attempt to suppress that continued rise of China. Then in 2020, from the Chinese perspective, we had an escalation in what they see as US hostility toward China. First, there was what the Chinese would call slandering China over the pandemic, blaming China for the pandemic and its effects in the United States. Calls for an acceleration of economic decoupling between the United States and China. And then later in the year, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that the United States could not peaceably live with a China under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party. So to have a change of government in the United States is a huge issue for Beijing, especially this year, this cycle. So that leads us to the question for today. What is the Chinese government's message to the new administration? Of course, we can't see or hear what goes on behind closed doors, but we can examine what's in that open media outreach that the Chinese are putting forward. How useful would the Chinese message be in actually improving relations with the United States? How much impact might it have on the new administration based on the content? So to tackle this question, I created a kind of a sample. Rather than looking at one speech by one important person, I got a bit of a variety. I used a recent speech by Wang Yi, who's the Chinese foreign minister, a couple of speeches by Cui Tiankai, who's the Chinese ambassador to the United States, and an editorial by two Chinese scholars who work for what they claim is an independent Chinese think tank. There isn't really such a thing. And interestingly, there's a bit of difference in all three of these sources, but there is some commonality. So I think that makes it a stronger sample to see that there's some areas that all the Chinese commentators are emphasizing, but yet they're allowed to pursue their messaging and, with slightly different angling based on their institutional interests. So now let me very quickly analyze what I found to be the content of that Chinese messaging. There are 5 what I would call consensus points. That is 5 points that all of those sources that I looked at made the same point in 5 cases. The first point they all made is that US-China relations are at a low point, or at the lowest point they've ever been since the United States and People's Republic of China normalized their relations. That the 2 countries are close to military conflict, and reminding Americans that a war would be, or a military conflict would be bad for the United States as it would be bad for China. The second point they all make is that the blame for the situation rests squarely with the United States government. The United States government bears the blame, and also therefore the onus is on the United States government to correct the situation, to improve the situation. And the commentators tend to focus on the rhetoric coming out of US government officials or official commentators as being a main contributor to the deterioration of the bilateral relationship, especially in about the last year, referring to a few quotes: reckless remarks, attempts to incite distrust and hatred, distortions of history. So the solution from the Chinese point of view is for Americans to, as the Chinese put it, to reflect on their mistakes and to stop acting and speaking in bad faith, with ill intentions toward China, ulterior motives. Americans must stop criticizing China over Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, the pandemic, China's political system, etc. The third point they make is to resurrect an old Chinese mantra, which is to restore cooperation and manage differences. In other words, don't let political problems interfere with the maximum possible amount of economic engagement between China and the United States. Don't economically decouple. This would be bad for both countries. Drop the trade tariffs. They give assurances that given time, China will on its own reform its economic relations with foreign countries in ways that will satisfy the American dissatisfaction with the inequity in the trade relationship. They go on to say Americans should stop persecuting Chinese companies under the excuse of national security. Huawei was a big part of that. And stop restricting people-to-people exchanges out of fear that the Chinese involved in those exchanges might be spying out US technology. The fourth point that these commentators make is that Americans, and particularly the incoming administration, should draw guidance from what the Chinese call Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy. You've heard of Xi Jinping thought. He has a particular collection of ideas with regard to foreign relations that are known as Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy. Frankly, it's a collection of nice sounding but empty slogans that have little to do with actual practice of Chinese foreign policy. But the commentators appeal to the United States to join China in, quote, building a community of mankind for a shared future that will be good for everyone. And along with this, there's a repeat of assurances from Chinese officials that China does not seek hegemony, doesn't seek a sphere of influence, and never interferes in other countries' internal affairs. The fifth point these commentators make is that the United States should stop acting like a superpower. The Chinese pointedly say that what Americans call universal values are really Western values, that they don't take into account Chinese traditions or another important part of the world's way of doing things. They say that the Americans' extolled political liberalism is not a superior system, that the making of international rules should be more democratic, meaning that countries like China should have more influence. And in short, that the United States should stop trying to dominate the region and should make way for China to have more say in strategic affairs in the Asia-Pacific region. So that said, I'll now give my own 5 points of analysis in reaction to the 5 points made by the Chinese commentators. My first point would be that some of the advice that the Chinese give to the incoming American administration is potentially acceptable. might have some resonance. I think most Americans would agree that a new Cold War between the United States and China would be a bad thing. Conflict would certainly be a bad thing, military conflict. Lots of Americans would argue that total economic decoupling is not practical, even if some limited form of it is. And plenty of Americans would also agree that insisting on the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party as a condition for the United States having a constructive and stable relationship with China is not realistic. My second point would be that it's pretty clear that China very badly wants to return to the old status quo, that is maximum Chinese access to US markets and US technology. Why? Because China is still in catch-up mode, and revenue and technology from the USA is fueling China's rapid economic growth. Less access to that revenue and technology would be a serious setback for China's developmental plans. China is in fact racing to achieve great power status before it runs into a long-term economic slowdown, which might be the result of some gathering major structural factors. However, a return to the old status quo is not possible because China is now a serious competitor and a potential adversary to the United States in a deeper way than it was in recent decades. Therefore, the United States is less tolerant of an unfair and unbalanced economic relationship than it might have been a decade or two ago. The irony here is that China is asking the United States not to politicize economic relations. When, if it wasn't clear already, it certainly became clear in the last year that China is the world leader in politicizing economic relations. China uses economic relationships to punish other governments over political disagreements. My third point, none of the commentators that I sampled specifically mentioned the Taiwan issue in US-China relations. Now, there have been lots of periods in recent history in US-China relations where one could not imagine that in a forum like that the Chinese would miss a chance to mention Taiwan, mention their dissatisfaction with the amount of support that the United States gives to what the Chinese consider to be a separatist government. These commentators mentioned Taiwan only in the most indirect way by using the phrase mutual respect, very indirect in that if you scratch the surface of what the Chinese mean by mutual respect, eventually you get to, it means respect for each other's core interests. And then you get to China arguing that Taiwan being a part of China is a core interest and the United States ought to recognize that. So why didn't these Chinese commentators mention Taiwan specifically? Is it because Taiwan is no longer a problem in the US-China relationship? Hardly. In fact, during the Trump administration, the United States government took lots of small but significant steps to enhance and upgrade US relationship with the Taiwan government. So my explanation would be that I see Chinese commentators so fearful that the relationship itself between the United States and China is in such jeopardy that they simply put aside what is in this case even a very major issue within that relationship to focus on repairing the relationship itself. And this is why Taiwan wasn't mentioned specifically. My fourth point, obvious from my short rendition of the points that the Chinese made, is that the Chinese side does not recognize any responsibility for the downturn in relations between China and the United States. Very problematic from the US point of view. And my fifth and final point is that the Chinese view of US-China relations largely fails to connect with the US view. The US view in short would be, first of all, seeing the United States as if it's a hegemon, a dominant country in the region, Americans think that the United States is a benign hegemon. That is, it mostly upholds rules and norms that are good for most countries, the so-called rogue countries aside. That the United States has consistently, through several presidential administrations of different parties, welcomed a strong China, although also a responsible China, which China, of course, has problems with. And the United States, throughout this last couple of decades, has been relatively welcoming and friendly and inclusive of China and overlooked a lot of what Americans consider to be bad Chinese behavior. And that indeed, in recent years, the United States has somewhat felt betrayed by China, particularly under the Xi Jinping regime, under which China has backslid, both in terms of what Americans like to see as the progress of liberal values in China, and also in China's foreign relations, foreign behavior. So that Americans generally, I think, would argue that China in many ways is now an outlaw state. And finally, Americans still think that US preeminence is necessary to US security and prosperity in the region, and therefore are not going to be open to prompts by the Chinese that it's time for the United States to leave the region as a major strategic power. So in sum, one could say that the United States and China have a shared desire to improve relations, but they disagree on how to do it. Rather, each side expects the other side to concede. This concludes my lecture.